Most people who discovered the Whittakers online formed their opinions quickly. They saw a few viral clips, heard grunts instead of speech, watched a family living in a tumble-down house in rural West Virginia, and instantly assumed they understood everything. To outsiders, it looked like a bizarre, almost unbelievable case of extreme inbreeding by choice. A family who decided to marry within their own bloodline until the consequences spilled into plain sight. But that interpretation is built on modern assumptions, the idea that people today have choices, options, awareness, and access to information. For families like the Whittakers, the foundation of their story is not choice. It's isolation, generational poverty, and a level of abandonment so deep that it shaped genetics, language, and even identity before anyone outside their mountain holler ever knew they existed. In the modern world, people are used to mobility. They take for granted that they can drive to another town, attend college, meet someone online, build a life in another state, or access medical care. Even the poorest people in cities encounter doctors, social workers, schools, and strangers. They're visible. But in remote Appalachian regions like West Virginia, life historically grew inward instead of outward. The mountains acted like walls. Roads were scarce. There were no buses, no trains, and for decades, cars were luxuries few could afford. Families didn't stay where they were because they loved isolation. They stayed because they couldn't leave. In a place with such limited mobility, the concept of meeting new people didn't exist. A young person's future romantic or social relationships were usually determined by proximity, not preference, not attraction, and certainly not awareness of genetic consequences. If you were born into a valley of 40 to 70 people, you didn't dream of meeting a spouse somewhere else. You expected to marry someone you lived near, someone you grew up with, someone who probably shared your last name. This didn't happen because families ignored biology. It happened because no one taught them biology to begin with. Education is the dividing line between possibility and confinement. In cities, every child learns something about human genetics, about reproduction, about inherited illness, about sexual boundaries. In isolated, forgotten hollers, children rarely reached high school. Many didn't reach middle school. Some didn't attend school at all. They survived on subsistence living, farm work, coal money when it existed, and eventually disability checks when the coal industry collapsed and health declined. When communities lack education, access, transportation, and services, they begin to mirror environments where evolution and genetics follow a different path, one dictated by limitations, not decisions. This is the real context behind the Whittakers. Generations before Betty's children were born, their ancestors lived in the exact same holler and had contact only with the families who lived within walking distance. Imagine generation after generation marrying not because they choose cousin over stranger, but because strangers never arrived. Imagine growing up with no schoolteacher to explain consequences, no social worker to intervene, no doctor to treat disabilities or warn against genetic risks. Imagine repetition becoming a way of life, not out of ignorance, but out of absence. The Whittakers didn't fall behind. They were never allowed to start. Once disabilities began appearing, physical deformities, neurological impairments, developmental delays, no one identified them. No school documented them. No doctor diagnosed them. And no government agency stepped in to help. Without names for their conditions, without medical records, without education, the family lived through their disabilities as just how life is. A lack of speech wasn't recognized as neurological damage, it was simply accepted as a personality trait. A mental disability wasn't treated, it was adapted to. This lack of treatment multiplied the effects. Disabilities that could have been mitigated with therapies, medications, or even basic care grew worse over time. Simple impairments became severe impairments. small developmental delays became permanent lifelong challenges. What could have been addressed in one generation was instead compounded in the next. In addition to genetic risks from isolation, every disability worsened through neglect. Not intentional neglect from the family, but neglect from the outside world. By the time cameras arrived, much of the visible damage was assumed to be the direct result of incest. But the truth is more complicated. Genetics shapes a foundation, but environment develops it or deteriorates it. In the Whittakers case, both forces collapsed simultaneously. Disabilities from inbreeding merged with disabilities from environmental neglect, lack of medical treatment, untreated illnesses, nutritional deficiencies, and psychological deprivation. A combination no family, anywhere, could survive unscathed. Their home became not just a place to live, but a closed ecosystem where each generation inherited both biological limitations and social isolation. People saw the consequences, but not the cause. When viral videos brought the Whittakers into the public eye in the 2000s and again in 2020, what shocked outsiders most was not poverty. Poverty exists everywhere. It wasn't disabilities. Disabilities affect millions. It was the collision of extreme isolation, extreme poverty, and extreme unaddressed medical needs. Because that collision is rare and rarely ever filmed. The internet turned the family into spectacle. Millions watched, few helped, fewer understood. Viewers assumed the Whittakers represented some unusual, freakish pocket of society. But families like theirs exist in rural pockets all over the world. In parts of the Middle East, South Asia, remote African tribes, and even other Appalachian valleys. The difference is visibility. Most communities like this remain hidden, unacknowledged, and unrecorded. The Whittakers only became known because one man happened to document them. They didn't represent something new, they revealed something ignored. The Whittakers' story forces uncomfortable questions. How much control does a person really have when they are born into isolation so complete that mobility, education, and awareness never enter their life? Why does society blame families like this for conditions created by a lack of support society itself failed to provide? Why do people feel entitled to judge circumstances they never had to endure? The Whittakers did not choose their genetics. Their ancestors did not choose ignorance. They were shaped into invisibility over decades. Their story is not about mutation, not about strangeness, not about shock value. It is about a forgotten community left to determine its own evolution, without access to anything that could change its trajectory. In a world where the privileged obsess over nature versus nurture, the Whittakers stand as proof that nurture often fails before nature has a chance. Their existence is not a mystery. It is a consequence, a result of geography, poverty, and a nation that allowed isolation to harden into genetic crisis. For generations, the world never asked who they were. The question now is, why didn't anyone ask sooner? Backhand index pointing right comment below. Do you think America ignores its most remote communities, or does it simply not know they exist? Share your thoughts. Hey everyone, before we get into the next part, I've got something special to share with you. If you're all about making your home smarter, cozier, and just a little bit more you, then you've got to check this out. We've partnered with trekbo.com, a place built for people who love clever solutions and everyday comfort. From wellness and skincare must-haves to smart home gadgets, heated gear, and lifestyle tech, Trekbo is packed with products that make life easier, warmer, and way more fun. I've personally picked some of my favorite finds, things that actually work, look great, and make your day smoother. Whether it's something to simplify your morning routine, help you unwind after a long day, or bring a little innovation into your home, you'll find it there. So before you scroll past, take a quick look at trekbo.com. Trust me, it's full of discoveries waiting to make your everyday better. Alright, now let's get back to it. Because after this video, you're definitely going to want to explore what Trekbo has in store for the Whittaker household community. When people first encountered the Whittakers through viral videos and online documentaries, a wave of shock spread through the public. The strange communication, the eerie sounds, the severe cognitive impairments, and the collapsing home created an image that seemed almost unreal. But despite the attention and fascination, the most important question was rarely asked. Why did no one help them before the cameras arrived? This is where the second part of the Whittakers' story becomes clearer. For decades, this family didn't just live in poverty, they lived in complete invisibility. Not just hidden behind trees and mountains, but hidden behind an American system that rarely looks for the people who live beyond paved roads and outside organized communities. The Whittakers represent what happens when a family exists off the grid without choosing to be there. They weren't survivalists or homesteaders. They didn't romanticize being away from society. They simply lived where they were born, and their world never expanded. They inherited not land or wealth, but distance. Distance from education, distance from healthcare, distance from opportunity, distance from outside relationships. In most rural areas, geographic isolation eventually gets broken by highways, schools, government programs, or commerce. But in places like Odd, West Virginia, some families never fully entered modern society. The coal industry once connected Appalachia to the outside world, but when the mines collapsed, entire towns were left scattered like abandoned ruins. Businesses closed. Transportation routes became unnecessary. Doctors left. Teachers left. Social workers didn't arrive. The world moved forward, and these families didn't just stay behind. They were left behind. This abandonment wasn't loud. It didn't make news headlines. It simply happened quietly over decades. Consider how disability assistance works in America. A person must have documentation, medical records, physician notes, proof of diagnosis, school records, paperwork. But what happens when people with disabilities are never diagnosed, never tested, and never assessed by professionals? What happens when those who need help are not only off the grid socially, but medically invisible? The answer is what we see in the Whittakers. Their impairments were passed down without treatment because no expert ever evaluated them in the first place. Their illnesses were never treated because hospitals never knew they existed. Their education was limited because no school held them accountable for missing class, and no one followed up when they disappeared from the system. They didn't just fall through the cracks. There were no cracks, because there was no foundation beneath them at all. Without intervention, isolation deepened generationally. The few relatives who managed to escape did not return. The shame surrounding disabilities and inbreeding in rural communities creates a culture of secrecy where even distant relatives pretend not to know their own family. Shame becomes a wall even stronger than geography. And so it becomes easier, in time, for silence to continue than for anyone to confront what happened. This silence is crucial to understanding the Whittakers' tragedy. Outsiders did not show up to help. They showed up with cameras. Documentarians did what doctors, teachers, and government agencies failed to do. They gave the Whittakers visibility. But visibility is a double-edged sword. The world suddenly saw them, but it saw them as spectacle, not as people who needed immediate intervention. Viewers expressed fascination more than concern. People shared videos not to advocate, but to react. The family became a viral curiosity. It's important to remember that exploitation wears many faces. It doesn't always come as cruelty. Sometimes it arrives as fascination, as charity, as raising awareness, all while collecting views, donations, and money that doesn't always reach the people being filmed. A question began to linger in many viewers' minds. If so many people were watching, why weren't their lives improving? This is where charity, particularly unregulated online charity, becomes dangerous. When money flows without oversight, when donations are sent not through trusted organizations but through individuals, the recipients have no protection. And ironically, the Whittakers' welfare and disability systems restrict how much money they're legally allowed to have before losing benefits. They cannot receive large donations directly without risking their healthcare, food assistance, and living allowance. So outsiders who try to save the family with money actually risk dismantling the only support the government provided them. In other words, the help could destroy them. This is the trap of welfare-based survival. Families like the Whittakers are kept alive through systems designed to sustain them at the lowest possible threshold. They aren't allowed to earn enough to rise above their circumstances. They are permitted to stay alive, but not advance. Poverty becomes legalized maintenance. Put simply, the government will feed you, medicate you, and keep you alive as long as you stay poor. This creates a heartbreaking irony. The Whittakers could not receive enough assistance to escape poverty without losing the assistance that kept them alive. Poverty became a requirement for survival. Education was never provided. Medical attention was never enforced. Family protection was never implemented. But poverty assistance was. A system that sustains, but never elevates, trapped them in generational dependency. This environment shaped the family long before genetic consequences compounded. Poverty and isolation came first. The genetics were just the result of an environment where the outside world never intervened and the inside world never expanded. Over time, as disabilities grew more severe, isolation increased further. Individuals with severe cognitive challenges cannot leave the holler to seek employment. They cannot form relationships outside the family. They cannot make independent decisions. They rely on whoever is near them, which tragically, in their case, meant relying on relatives to form relationships and reproduce. So while many people speculated that their family intentionally chose incest, the truth is more tragic. In an environment with no access to the outside world, there are no choices. And when outsiders finally arrived, they brought cameras, not solutions. Imagine if, instead of filming, someone had documented the need for medical evaluations, therapy, supervised living support, or education programs. Imagine if someone had fought to provide them sheltered housing with proper care. Imagine if someone had advocated for systemic intervention instead of viral attention. The saddest part isn't that the Whittakers were discovered for how they lived. It's that they were discovered far too late. For most families like theirs, intervention must happen generations before the consequences surface. When society ignores remote poverty long enough, the result doesn't simply become financial deprivation. It becomes genetic isolation. And once disabilities compound, they cannot be undone. You cannot reverse decades of untreated neurological conditions. You cannot unwrite how isolation shapes reproduction. You cannot give back the opportunities that were never allowed. You can only begin today, and hope that intervention begins before another generation is born into the same cycle. The Whittakers are no longer invisible. But visibility is not enough. Awareness that doesn't lead to responsibility is simply exploitation wrapped in empathy. Their story is not just a cautionary tale of inbreeding. It is a warning about what happens when a nation ignores its most vulnerable citizens until tragedy becomes spectacle. Backhand index pointing down, share your thoughts below. Do you believe visibility should lead to responsibility? Should viral content creators be required to help the people they film? Before the world judged the Whittakers, before strangers made jokes or turned their lives into viral shock content, almost no one asked the only question that mattered. Did they choose to live this way? People assumed the family decided to intermarry, that they willingly created generations of disability, that they didn't care about consequences. But the most tragic truth beneath their story is this. The Whittakers never chose incest. Incest was the result of having no choices at all. To understand how, we have to examine three brutal forces that shaped their lives long before genetic consequences appeared: poverty, isolation, and dependency. 1. Poverty isn't just a lack of money, it's a lack of options. When people think about poverty, they usually imagine hunger, dirty clothes, or old houses. But poverty isn't simply an empty wallet. It's a cage built out of limited opportunities. When a community lacks schools with functioning support systems, transportation or access to other towns, employment opportunities, healthcare, diagnosis and treatment, stable social services, then every generation grows up having fewer possibilities than the last. People in urban poverty can still move, ride a bus, switch schools, meet different people. But people in rural, isolated poverty have no alternatives. There are no new faces. There are no places to go. There are no outsiders arriving, no clinics nearby, and no social programs actively searching for suffering families. In Odd, West Virginia, the landscape isolates the mind, not just the body. The mountains become both a home and a fence. Families like the Whittakers don't circulate through society where natural diversity happens. They remain inside the same small community, surrounded by the same few people, until marrying someone nearby always becomes marrying someone related. Not because they want to, because there is no one else there. This is how isolation becomes destiny. 2. Disabilities limit choices before someone is even old enough to make them. Even if the Whittakers wanted to break the cycle, many couldn't. Some family members could not speak. Others could not understand basic conversation. They were never taught functional living skills in school because their conditions were never properly diagnosed. They were never placed in special education programs because no one took the time to evaluate them. Many members of the family functioned at a cognitive level where they couldn't leave home independently. They couldn't navigate relationships outside their family. They relied entirely on caregivers within the same household. Children with severe disabilities don't go looking for partners. They rely on whoever is in front of them. Without structured care or supervised living, they grow into adults who still cannot make independent choices. So when outsiders criticize or mock this family, they ignore a harsh truth. You cannot hold people morally accountable for decisions they never had the capacity or freedom to make. 3. When dependency is generational, there's nowhere else to go. For families like the Whittakers, dependency isn't just personal, it spans generations. Multiple members of the family likely had cognitive impairments before modern medical systems existed in their town. Without schools pushing for evaluations, without doctors visiting homes, and without outreach programs, intellectual disabilities were never treated. Instead, they compounded. A child with untreated disabilities becomes an adult with untreated disabilities. That adult becomes a parent who cannot teach, protect, or provide opportunities. Their children inherit not only genetic problems but also lack of education and resources. And those children repeat the cycle. In most communities, social services intervene when disabilities affect living conditions. But in rural poverty, intervention is rare. Government agencies don't drive up gravel roads just to check on families. They respond only if someone calls. And no one called. The Whittakers did not hide from society. Society simply never came for them. For community abandonment is its own form of neglect. Many locals knew about the Whittakers for decades. Some offered food or basic help. Others avoided them out of discomfort or shame. The family was talked about quietly but never confronted openly. They became the people up the road, spoken about behind closed doors, almost like a secret. In tight rural communities, familiarity can create blindness. People get used to seeing severe poverty until it blends into the landscape like old barns and rusted cars. The Whittakers weren't hidden by trees, they were hidden by normalization and silence. The fact that so many locals knew and said nothing reveals something painful. To ignore something long enough is to accept it. 5. When the outside world finally paid attention, it was too late. It's easy for the public to ask, why didn't they stop it? Why didn't they get help? Why didn't anyone move away? But by the time anyone realized how severely isolated this family had become, most members were already disabled adults. Their childhood health and education needs were never addressed. Their opportunity to form normal relationships had passed long before a camera ever reached their porch. The world arrived after the damage was done, not to prevent it, but to witness it. And when the cameras finally rolled, they revealed a story not of scandal or immorality, but of unbearable neglect, not by the family, but by a system that never protected them. 6. The Whittakers are not a horror story, they are a warning. Their genetic outcome is not a freak accident. It's a predictable result of extreme poverty, complete geographic isolation, lack of compulsory education enforcement, lack of medical care, absence of welfare intervention, community silence, generational disability left untreated. That combination doesn't just produce poverty, it produces genetic entrapment. The Whittakers are not the most inbred family in America because they chose to be. They became a symbol of what happens when a society leaves vulnerable people unattended long enough that medical, social, and genetic consequences collide. Kids born into isolation do not choose their future. Adults with cognitive disabilities cannot escape theirs. A community without resources cannot save them. And a government without outreach programs will never even find them. This isn't a story about incest. It's a story about invisible lives turning into visible tragedies. 7. What the world saw was the outcome, not the cause. People asked the wrong question. How could they let this happen? The real question is, how could we let this happen to them? They didn't choose isolation. They didn't choose poverty. They didn't choose disability. They didn't choose intermarriage. They inherited every one of those circumstances like others inherit wealth, opportunity, and education. Their tragedy was not a decision. It was a birthright carved by economic collapse and sustained by government neglect. They are not a spectacle. They are a mirror, showing us what happens when America stops looking. Backhand index pointing down, share your thoughts below. Do you believe the government should be legally required to intervene in isolated families before tragedies like this occur? Should neglect by the system be treated as a form of abuse? For decades, the Whittaker family lived in a place hidden but visible, ignored but known, neglected yet not forgotten, just avoided. When the world finally saw them on camera, people reacted with shock, disgust, fascination, sympathy, and outrage. But what almost no one asked was the question that changes everything. Who was responsible for helping them long before a camera arrived? The Whittakers' situation didn't appear suddenly. It was built by decades of neglect, not from family members, but from the systems whose job it was to intervene: schools, local government, healthcare, social services, and community protections. If we're going to understand the most inbred family in America, we must stop trying to blame them and start asking why the institutions designed to protect vulnerable people allowed this to happen. The Whittakers are not a scandal. They are evidence in plain sight. Evidence of how fully a nation can fail its most vulnerable people. 1. The myth of family choice and the reality of systemic abandonment. The public often assumes that families like the Whittakers choose isolation. They assume they decided to live without medical care, or refused education, or wanted to stay cut off from society. But this myth ignores the mechanics of poverty. Rural isolation isn't a decision. It's a condition. When families live miles from services, without reliable transportation, without money, without access to information or care, choice disappears. What remains is survival. Everything becomes reactive, not deliberate. You don't choose not to see a doctor. You simply have no doctor nearby, no insurance, no transport, no phone to call one. You don't choose not to go to school. You stay home because your disability was never diagnosed, or there are no special education teachers, or your parent has no way to take you there. You don't choose unhealthy relationships. You simply exist within a tiny circle of people who are all you ever meet. When outsiders say, they should have left, they misunderstand something deeper. Leaving requires education, money, health, access, and social support, none of which the Whittakers ever had. No one chooses to stay in a cage when they have the means to walk out. The tragedy is that they never had a door. Schools knew, and still failed them. Every child in the United States is legally entitled to education, including specialized learning support for disabilities. So how did a family with obvious neurological impairments fall through the cracks? The answer lies in the difference between schooling and education. Nearly all public systems assume that students walk through the school doors. But in isolated regions, especially before the 1990s, schools rarely sent professionals into the mountains to track missing children. If a parent never enrolled a disabled child, it was often overlooked, especially if the child couldn't communicate or was already cognitively impaired. School districts in rural communities faced ongoing problems. No special education teachers, lack of funding, limited transportation, families too poor to fight for services, parents themselves lacking education and unable to advocate. In many cases, schools relied on parents to report disabilities. But in families like the Whittakers, where disability has been present for generations, identifying developmental impairment requires training. Training their caregivers never received. The system waited for a request for help from people who didn't know how to ask. How could the Whittakers seek special education if they couldn't read? They couldn't communicate normally? They didn't know such services existed? They didn't slip through the cracks. They were never invited into them. 3. Healthcare never reached them, and that's critical. What happens to a community that has no clinics nearby, no mental health services, no mobile health units, no preventive screening, no transportation, no encouragement to seek care? Disability isn't diagnosed. Medical records don't exist. Genetic concerns aren't questioned. Generations pass with no recognition of medical risk. The only time people in isolated poverty see a doctor is when trauma or immediate danger forces them into emergency rooms. Genetics isn't treated in emergency rooms. Disability isn't treated in emergencies. Poverty doesn't get a prescription. A lack of diagnosis isn't just medical negligence. It creates a legal blind spot. Without diagnosis, social services don't get alerted. Disability benefits aren't correctly assigned. Educational aids aren't provided. Child care protections aren't implemented. The absence of a medical record becomes a protective shield for neglect, not because caregivers don't care, but because society never documented the problem. The truth is shocking. The Whittakers might never have had children together if healthcare intervention had existed. Genetic counseling, supervision, disability protections, long-term assisted living. These systems step in to prevent exploitation, harm, and unsafe relationships. But none of these systems ever touched West Virginia, until a camera did. The Whittakers didn't hide from the healthcare system. The healthcare system never came to find them. For welfare protects resources, not people. Some viewers ask, they got government assistance, so how were they neglected? Because welfare programs provide survival, not well-being. SNAP, food stamps, doesn't inspect anyone's living conditions. SSI, disability income, doesn't check if someone is being exploited. Medicaid doesn't require therapy, supervision, education, or daily living care. These programs keep people alive. They do not keep them safe. The Whittakers survived through benefits, but survival is not protection. In fact, because their benefits existed and their needs were technically being met, social services had no trigger to intervene. The system assumed that because they weren't starving, they didn't require intervention. This is why the Whittaker story is not just tragic, it's instructive. It shows that welfare without oversight simply sustains generational neglect. 5. Rural neglect is still abuse, but no one wants to call it that. If a disabled child with no education, no medical care, no supervision, and no protection lived in a city, would they be removed from their home? Absolutely. If an urban family experienced visible genetic collapse, random grunting, extreme disability, lack of health care, and unaddressed neurological impairments, would a state intervene? Without question. So why were the Whittakers treated differently? Because they lived in a place society never visits. Because they were quiet. Because they made no complaints. Because their suffering looked normal for where they lived. Isolation acted like camouflage. What would have been considered abuse anywhere else appeared, just how things are in the mountains. But here is the truth. Neglect caused by poverty is still neglect. Neglect caused by ignorance is still neglect. Neglect caused by lack of access is still neglect. And neglect that leads to genetic harm is abuse by the system, not the family. The abuse was not incest. The abuse was everything that allowed it to happen unchecked. 6. So who is responsible? To answer responsibly, we must assign accountability to systems, not scapegoats. Pushpin schools failed them by never initiating special education support. Pushpin healthcare professionals failed them by never establishing preventive outreach. Pushpin local government failed them by not providing transportation to services. Pushpin welfare systems failed them by funding survival without protections. Pushpin the state failed them by not recognizing rural isolation as a high-risk environment requiring monitoring. Pushpin communities failed them by normalizing their suffering as just how they live, instead of treating it as a call for help. Most tragically, Pushpin America failed them by treating rural disabled families as invisible. The Whittakers are not a case of family immorality. They are a case study in national neglect. 7. What needs to change? If this story is going to mean anything, it must lead to solutions. Here are reforms that could protect future families like the Whittakers. Mandatory rural outreach programs. If someone can't reach help, help must reach them through mobile healthcare units, traveling genetic counselors, mental health workers, special education evaluators. B. Automatic intervention for isolated disabled adults. Disabled individuals living without monitored support should trigger state oversight, not just benefit payments. C. Rural transportation subsidies. Medical and educational access cannot exist without transportation. Roads matter as much as hospitals. D. Required reporting from agencies that provide welfare. If someone receives disability income without accompanying medical records or active oversight, agencies must investigate. Genetic counseling programs for isolated regions. This is not about judgment. It is about protection, autonomy, and dignity. People deserve informed choices. These policies are not luxuries. They are necessities to prevent future tragedies disguised as mountain living. 8. The Whittakers now stand as a warning, not a shame. The world looked at the Whittakers and saw a spectacle. Experts saw a case study. But a nation with conscience should see something else. a failing so profound that it became visible in their DNA. Generations of systemic abandonment carved itself into their faces, speech, minds, and bodies. The Whittakers did not inherit inbreeding. They inherited neglect. They inherited invisibility. They inherited a world where no one came to help until a filmmaker with a camera arrived. The real question now is not who they are, but who we are, if we look at them and do nothing. Backhand index pointing down. Comment below. Do you believe America should treat rural isolation of disabled people as a public emergency deserving mandatory intervention? Should genetic risk trigger state support, the same way physical abuse does? Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.